Welcome to the Religion Media Centre weekly Zoom briefing, which is the last of 2022. And it's an opportunity for us to review the year, which has been something of a year, I must say. The event today is going to be live tweeted by Sorcha, and this is Sorcha's last weekly Zoom briefing for us. She's going off to pastures news, so thank you for everything, Sorcha. And I know you're going to go out with a bang, so there'll be live tweets throughout. And Sorcha, as usual, ask your permission to take a gallery picture of everyone on the chat box. And just one other housekeeping note is in the chat box, if you'd like to put your questions in there, please do so. But the chat box we regard as private for the Zoom, so please ask you not to copy and paste it as we go. So welcome to the review of 2022, and what a year it's been. War in Ukraine, the death of the Queen, 3 prime ministers, a cost of living crisis, the Lambeth Conference of Bishops from all around the world, a freedom of religion or belief conference in July, to name some of the headlines from the year. And we are joined by several guests to go through each topic as we go. But we're going to start with the Queen, I think, if we may, with Catherine Pepinster, and then go on to politics with Steve and Abby. So you're up first then, Catherine. And all of us who are journalists have been working on news desks where we've been preparing for the Queen's death for many years. And of course, she reached a great age, but in the end, the end came suddenly in Scotland. I just wonder if you could ask you, Catherine, to review what happened in those final days and the speed with which the final events took place.
Yes, I think it was interesting how we all knew this was inevitable because she had such a great age, but nevertheless, I think it took people by surprise. She had looked increasingly frail. She clearly lost a lot of weight, and her mobility problems, as the palace used to call them, had hindered her from doing as much as she would once have done, missing sometimes significant events. She wasn't attending all her Platinum Jubilee events, for example, but she did appear to insist and really gather her strength, it seemed, for meeting her new prime minister and bidding her old one farewell, and then asking the next one to form a government. And then suddenly she died. And I think that took people in some ways unawares, but of course in other ways the media was prepared for it. They had a lot of material that they'd been putting together for a long time. They had a plan of action. The BBC certainly did, which quickly was put in force. I think the thing that really interested me about the response to it was that while people were sort of taken aback that it had happened, the extent of the trauma that I thought the country might go through didn't seem to be quite as considerable. Not because people didn't want to acknowledge the Queen's contribution to society, because they certainly did that, but the means by which that was done, the ceremonial, the vigil, the lying in state, the processions, the funeral, the committal service, they all provided means by which to express that response to her death. And so I think it highlighted how much ritual is important for people, how we need those expressions in our lives, in particular ways that are set down, and the country I think made use of that. And I found that interesting as somebody who's interested in religion does provide that for people.
Also, there were new rituals invented with the queue,
yes,
this long queue that snaked for miles. Yeah.
So we've seen new rituals in recent times. For example, with the death of Diana in 1997, we saw this ritual of people gathering outside palaces to lay flowers, put out photographs of the dead person, and that again happened this time round with Diana's funeral. After it happened and she was driven to her burial site at Althrop, people threw flowers before the hearse. The same thing happened here. So we see rituals being used, old ones, new ones, old ones adapted, to provide people with a means of expressing their emotions. And the queue was a great example of that, but was also incredibly British, I think, because there was this very orderly queue to do something which the British seem to like to do. But the thing that was remarkable about the queue, and I went to it, was that it was very much an expression of contemporary Britain. There were a remarkable range of people, young and old, very, very mixed group of individuals. There would be an old soldier with his blazer on, with his medals, next to a young woman in a hijab. It was a real mix of people, and for once, we seem to have a united kingdom.
And another thing that was mentioned from the very start of the grieving process was her Christian faith. Everyone spoke about her, paid tribute to her decades on the throne, but it was all bound up with the fact that she had this true Christian faith that seemed to shine through all the various episodes of life that we witnessed.
Yes, and of course, because she was the queen of the television age, her link with religion was evident, because we saw her constantly at church services, Maundy service, Thursday services. She was always at the cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. So we linked her to religion, formal expressions of religion, her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. But it was apparent, not only from the what she said at her coronation, but also through her Christmas messages, particularly of recent years, that this wasn't just a formality for her, that she had a very strong personal faith, and she linked her beliefs to her work, very much so.
And now we have a king, King Charles III, and in the few months that he's been on the throne, he's visited many places of worship, met many different representatives of different faiths. And I wonder what conclusions you draw as you see the emphasis that he's put on this in the first few weeks of his reign.
I think one of the most noticeable things that happened after the Queen died was an event which wasn't planned until quite recently. So we knew that there were plans laid down for the death of the Queen and the accession of Charles III, and we knew certain things would happen. So it had been planned for a long time that he would attend services around Britain in the devolved nations in the run-up to the Queen's funeral, for example. And those had ecumenical aspects to them and interfaith aspects too. But he then held a reception at Buckingham Palace before his mother's funeral, a couple of days or so before, where he committed himself to protecting all faiths in Britain. There were faith leaders there from across such a wide range of faiths, to hear him make this commitment in front of them. And since then, he has attended a lot of, let's call them broadly, faith events. Some of them are, you might call conventional ones. So he went to a reception in Dunfermline Abbey to thank people who'd done a lot of work after the Queen died up near Balmoral. He went to a service in the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace for members of the Order of Merit. He was at the cenotaph. So those are the kind of things you would expect a monarch to do. But he also has he's been to a Guru Nanak Gurdwara in Luton. He's been to the Jewish JW3 Centre for a Hanukkah reception. He's been to an Ethiopian church, and he's demonstrated his interest in different faiths and his engagement with those faiths. But these what you might call the less conventional occasions, I noticed that they always seem to involve him talking to people about faith in action, about engaging with people who reach out to the community, and often the community beyond their own faith. He's been to visit community food halls, community bakeries. He's talked to refugees, asylum seekers being helped by these faith organisations. And then at another event, which you might think was terribly conventional, which was a Westminster Abbey carol service that his daughter-in-law, the Princess of Wales, has been very involved with. At that, he asked for a poem to be read about a refugee. So he has an interest in faith, but I think he also has an interest in how faith affects how people live.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Catherine. And we're going to do another Zoom in the new year, looking ahead to the next year. So looking forward to your hopes or fears about what may happen next year with the royal family. So that was one huge event this year. Can we move on to politics now, and joined by the Rev Steve Chalke, who is the founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust, and Professor Abby Day, Professor of Race, Faith and Culture at Goldsmiths, University of London. So, tumultuous year. I mean, we've never seen anything like it. 3 prime ministers, dozens of new secretaries of state over the year. I'd start with you, Steve, take you back to July, when Boris Johnson resigned. And this was after a groundswell of discontent over the parties at number 10 and over the Chris Pincher affair. And there were questions being asked about him. Until the end, it seemed as though the dam burst. And I wonder how you reflect on that when it comes to the values that we hold in British society. The values were stretched to such an extent until eventually the dam burst. Is that how you saw what happened, this far and no further?
It was a problem. I mean, I come at this from a local community level. We run 52 schools, endless youth work with kids out on the streets. We work in custody centres and we work in the A&Es of hospitals. And in that work, we got 32,000 children in our schools. In that work, I think it was clear to everyone, all of our education is values-led. We work very, very hard at character development, and yet at the very top of society, young people, this isn't my comment, it's their comment, at the very top of society, we were seeing something else worked out all the time. So as I was talking to a group of sixth formers in one of our schools in London, actually in those weeks in which the whole crisis came to a head, they were gently mocking about what we call the Oasis 9 habits, which are the lens through which we do all of our curriculum and pedagogy, whatever subjects you're doing. The character development. We talk about character and curriculum and community as all being important, but they were gently mocking of me, saying, but the way you get to the top in our society now is by a completely different set of values. Somebody asked me how many of the Oasis 9 habits I thought Boris Johnson displayed. And there was that sense of irony, going back to the Queen, on her Platinum Jubilee, when Boris, the Prime Minister still then, was asked to read in St. Paul's Cathedral from the words of St. Paul, whatever is good, whatever is pure, think on these things, and endless press inches developed and columns around that since then. So yes, long answer to a short question, but I do think that the way that our political elite have handled themselves, the infighting, but not just the Prime Minister's behaviour, the constant swapping of Prime Ministers, not including Gavin Williamson. There have been 5 secretaries of state for education since then. So it adds to chaos at the top, and it makes children in the system feel that they don't matter, that there's no coherent strategy, and that the things we're teaching about character really don't matter at all. That comes through loud and clear.
Has there been a lasting impact there on it? I'm just wondering whether the kind of comparative settled fact that we've had a Prime Minister in for at least a couple of months now, the comparative settled state now may have changed opinions, or do you think it's had a really lasting impact on the young people that you work with?
I think it's had a lasting impact on them. All these things can change, and I think we're in early days now. But I think that the respect for Parliament has gone. We did an event recently because one of our schools is very close to Parliament, one of our secondary schools, and we did an event just a few weeks ago with a group of politicians who came. We were talking about racism. Each of them I respect greatly. I really do respect greatly. I invited them, but you saw this thing working out where, well, these are just politicians, aren't they? We have some rebuilding to do. I'm optimistic that rebuilding can be done.
Thank you, Steve. Can I bring in Abby Day now? Because you work with university students. I wonder if you've witnessed the same impact of the political turmoil on the students that you work with at universities.
I think, as Steve was saying, young people were pretty dispirited by what they saw. But also, I do think it wasn't really, for many of them, a surprise. That's one of the values I think that has been really evident in that generation, whether we call them Gen Z, digital natives, and before them, the millennials. There had been a shift, I think, towards other values that they would see as more, let's say, authentic and more inclusive and more respected. And that seems to be a very strong value shared, and one that explains, I think, a lot. When we looked, for example, at the results from the census, we saw the dramatic increase of people who say they have no religion. That's very much fueled by that age group. And that age group, in having no religion, has incredibly strong values. Younger people and Gen Zs, in the research I've been doing since 2001, other people's research as well, we see this consistently, that there is a different set of values. They certainly have despaired at the values of institutionalized Christianity. I think, again, that explains their departure from the Church of England. The baby boomers departed. They didn't raise their children to be religious. And so we see a religious generational impact when we look at the big numbers. And we also see an impact in terms of the values that were shared, the values that were treasured. And so we have, I mean, as well be, admitted not so long ago, as he described, the Church of England as institutionally racist. Well, young people won't put up with that. They value things like diversity. They saw the Church of England bishops and the House of Lords vote consistently against same-sex marriage. Young people won't tolerate that. And so there are values in an institutionalized Christianity that a lot of younger people are seeing and saying, we don't want that. In the same way, they can look at what's going on in Parliament and think, who are these jokers? Who are these people? So the sense of, I guess those sense of values has been very strong. And I'm sure we're going to see more evidence of it, not only through things like the census, but generally more evidence as young people grow into the roles that they are now going into of, in the public domain and corporate world.
So you mentioned the census there, and the number of people identifying as Christian has gone down below half to 46%. You've been talking there about young people having very strong values. Where, in your view, talking to them, what's the bedrock of the value system that they have? How do they share values without any reference to anything outside?
Well, they have a lot of reference to things outside. And let's not forget that the baby boomers who raised them were the generation that really grew up with the civil rights movements, that grew up with the human rights movements. And so they have very strong values that relate to them in terms of inclusivity, in terms of diversity. And those are the bedrock of society, they would argue, the bedrock of a healthy society. In contrast, certainly when I've interviewed the baby boomers, my most recent research just ended, they were now in their 60s, 70s, appalled at what they saw as they grew up in the 60s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, as a contrast with institutionalized religion and what they saw as the most important values. And they saw an opposition there. And so they raised their children, they're now millennial children and having an impact on the Gen Zs and the grandchildren. They raised them with those sorts of values, which to some, when I interviewed them, I heard words like those are non-negotiable. What's non-negotiable? What's sacred to them? Issues like diversity, equality, inclusivity. And so they said when they looked at an institution that in their eyes was patriarchal, hierarchical, racist, not diverse, they saw a contrast there and a conflict. And so we were talking earlier about the Queen. I was interested in what Catherine was saying about that. My previous research was about the generation of the Queen's age who were unflinching in their loyalty to her. These are the older women that, like her, have been dying out. They weren't the women priests. They didn't want any of that. They were the kind of bedrock of the church in many ways. You know, they sat at the back, they made the teas, they did the coffees, but they also funded the church, hugely funded the church through their legacies and their donation and their labor. And that generation is disappearing and they're not being replaced by their baby boomer children. And so as the Queen died, I think saw really the last vestige of that kind of devotion.
Thank you very much, Abby. Can I go back to Steve Chalke at this point? Steve, you've been talking about your work in schools and with young people. And another theme of last year, or this year, as we leave it, is the cost of living crisis. Obviously exacerbated by the war in Ukraine and energy prices going up, but also people unable to feed their families on their income. And I wonder, as you reflect back, if you could share with us some of the stories that you've witnessed over the last year and what you take away with you from 2022 about the cost of living crisis that you've seen.
What I view is this: the cost of living crisis is in itself a little bit of a middle class invention. In reality, the communities that Oasis works in across the country are all poor communities. That's what we chose to do as I set up Oasis 37 years ago. So every winter, there's a cost of living crisis. We, for instance, run a local library that I know pretty well and a community centre. Every single winter, that at the library we run for the local authority we run it for is packed with people. And as I often joke, some of them even come for a purpose involving a book. People come to keep warm. We've always done free tea and coffee and snacks and soup. People come to wash in the toilets. I know that's what they do, hot water. And that's happened all the time. The communities we work with, people have always got on the buses and ridden around on the buses because it's a cheap way of keeping warm. What's happened this year, because of all the other global issues that we're facing, Putin's war, et cetera, is that the cost of living crisis, the struggle to survive and to heat and eat, has spread to more people. And some of those are vocal, they're articulate. They can talk about their struggles in a way that the repressed minority, the bottom 10% perhaps of society, hasn't been able to and hasn't had a voice. We've set up through our schools and through the churches we run 39 what everybody calls warm spaces or warm banks. That's, in my view, a very poor name for these things. And it's why if you run a warm bank, you're very unlikely to get anyone to attend it because it's shame-inducing. It takes away dignity to walk through the doors. So we're running centres around the country which are open all day and open all evening and run films and bingo and poetry evenings and have food and et cetera, et cetera. But as people come to those centres, rich and poor, we find that there's just a hugely growing number of people who would have called and still call themselves middle class, but are accessing not just our warm spaces, but they're accessing the services we offer. In many of the places we work, we run community fridges and food banks, but we provide support and advice around debt, relationships, housing, immigration, etc., etc. And all of those services we're finding are being used more and more. And I add to it that our schools, I think this is the way of saying it actually, before the pandemic, if you'd have asked most people what a school did, they would have said, well, a school's there for learning. You know, what's learning? Well, it's maths and history and geography. It's a good curriculum and a good pedagogy. If you ask almost anybody today, what's a school there for? Well, they'll say all those things, but it's there for the emotional and mental health support of children. It's there to support whole families. It's there for the mums and the dads. It's about food, and it's about all those wraparound services. The role of schools has been stretched, but the funding hasn't. And back to the problem of the sixth Secretary of State for Education that we're on since the pandemic started, the funding hasn't grown, the responsibility has grown, the need has grown, but there's little continuity at the centre at the moment to help support all that needs to be done. Last comment from me, into that gap can step churches. And we talked about the decline of churches. What we find within Oasis, running churches and schools and et cetera, is where schools, going back to those first comments about faith groups that get involved, where churches and other faith groups get involved in the needs of the community, we find Oasis experiences growth. People come and get involved. If you like, they're looking for purpose, they're looking for community. Our mental health crisis is really a crisis of autonomy, isn't it? It's a crisis where we've lost all those social connections. We have therapists and we have psychologists because we don't have friends, aunts, uncles, grandparents, friendly neighbours anymore. Societies existed really well without therapists till this point. But the autonomization of society demands those things into that space where churches and other faith agencies will step. They're hugely welcomed and there's huge growth.
I'm going to get you back at the beginning of 2023, Steve, because I think we need a bit of uplifting comment as well. It's quite a depressing picture that you've painted there of a broken year, actually. 2022 was a broken year. This is a good moment, I think, to bring in Krish Kandiah, if you're there, Krish. Hi, hello, thank you for joining us. So Krish, you've been involved also in similar work to Steve, but in particular, if I could ask you to talk about your work with refugees who've been coming into the country. And I know that you work with refugees for a long time, but this year, of course, with the war in Ukraine, you've had particular programs there. Can you tell us something about what happened in 22? Your story of this year, how many people came forward, the work that was done, your hopes and fears?
Sure, Ruth. Thanks for the opportunity of being part of this today. And first, to all you journalists, thank you. Thank you for covering both the war in Ukraine and the plight of Afghan refugees in hotels. It's because of you that public empathy was really activated. And so thank you. Without you, there wouldn't have been this historic response. Let me give you a bit of context. So, Ruth mentioned I've been involved in one way or another with refugees for a while. I suppose my first intervention was around the Kosovan refugee crisis back in the 90s. My wife and I were missionaries in Albania, and we watched the Albanian nation welcome Kosovans who were actually economically more well off than their Albanian hosts, and they received an incredible welcome. And that really challenged me about what welcome could look like, that it isn't about having more money, but it's about having a big heart. But I got involved more recently in the Hong Kong resettlement. Do you remember in 2021, the UK government opened its British National Overseas Visa route, and we saw somewhere in the region of 120,000 Hong Kongers move to the UK in a pandemic, and it was fabulous to watch the church and other civil society groups really step up to offer a welcome and support to them. It's difficult moving countries in the middle of a pandemic. It's even more difficult when English might not be your first language, and there's been a rise in race-based hate crime against people of Southeast Asian appearance. And off the back of this mobilized force of people to offer that kindness and compassion, the government asked if we could help them with Afghans who had been evacuated from Kabul and placed into hotels around the country. We were able to mobilize lots of individual groups, often churches again, with a kind of front face of that compassion, visiting the hotels, finding out what particularly mums and children needed in terms of support, working with a fabulous baby bank called Baby Basics. We're able to help around 4,500 children and mums get what they needed in order to be able to begin to rebuild their lives. You know, things like prams and pushchairs so their children wouldn't be stuck in the hotel but could come out and you know, begin to engage in wider society. And I think it was due to the experience the government had of the overuse of hotels that they thought they needed another response to Ukraine. And you might remember in late February, early March, we were seeing, you know, hundreds of thousands of people be hosted in surrounding countries. Places like Moldova, a tiny country, was receiving over 100,000 Ukrainians, and places like Poland, historically a difficult relationship between Poland and Ukraine, but now incredible warmth and hospitality, and Romania too. And you might remember the Home Secretary Priti Patel had said that we would have an uncapped sponsorship program, and things went a little bit quiet after that, what that would look like. And I was a little bit nervous because I thought sponsorship programs are amazing, but they often are clunky. They take between 9 months and a year to kind of get going. And I was worried when we weren't hearing very much that this was a way of kicking things into the long grass. So some friends of mine and I got together and we launched a website, Sanctuary Foundation, we called it. And we asked people to pledge to be sponsors before there was any program, before there was any real mechanism for people to do that. And over the course of a week, I think around 29,000 people said they wanted to do that. And then we went to the government and said, look, the public are with you. They want to help you with this. Help us to help you. And other organizations did similar things. And it led to the government working in a really unusual way. They were in close partnership with civil society groups. So us, Sanctuary, groups like Reset and Citizens and Bernardo's all became part of the kind of design team to try and figure out how we could do the best we could in this mass evacuation. And there was a lot of criticism at the time, and I get it that, you know, the way the government decided to do it was the government would do the visas and they'd leave matching up to individuals. And you know, there were problems in that people were using Facebook. There were lots of safeguarding concerns. But my logic was, in the middle of an evacuation, sometimes you can play things differently than you might under normal circumstances.
It was a success, though, Krish, wasn't it? You did get thousands of people volunteering to take in refugees. Was it a success?
It was a success. A fantastic success. Over 106,000 Ukrainians are living with ordinary folk like you and me. That's never happened in our history. The closest we've got is 1939, the kinder transport. That was 10,000 Jewish children being hosted in ordinary people's homes. This is, you know, 10 times that in about 8 months. And one of the good things about this movement is that we haven't separated children from their parents. Most dads couldn't come because of the conscription, but mums could come with children, which was different from the kinder transport where we only were able to receive kids. So overall, it's been fantastic. And what's interesting to me is the people that have come forward haven't really got a long history of working with refugees. For some people, this is the first thing they've ever done. They haven't even given to a refugee charity. And the first thing they've done is to welcome a stranger into their home for 6 months. Now, one of the big challenges is what happens next. And we took a petition of about 4,500 hosts to Downing Street. It was delivered by a 8-year-old boy who knocked on the door and presented the petition over, and it was warmly received by a lovely police officer who promised to take it straight to the Prime Minister, which made Daniel's day. And what we said in the petition was that we love hosting. It's been an absolute privilege to host, but we're worried about what happens next for Ukrainians, because there's no social housing. There's very little rental properties on the private rental sector. Many landlords won't take people on universal credit. We need some help. And to their credit, the government has responded, not just to our voice, but I'm sure to others as well. And last week, they announced a £500 million initiative to help build or develop more social housing, not just for Ukrainians, but also for Afghans and for local homeless people. And we're already working on some projects that we could make use of that.
Great, thank you for explaining all of that, Krish. And at this point, I'd like to go to Dr. Katie Kelaidis, who joins us from America. You're the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum, and you write for Religion Dispatches, where we first came across your material, where you were talking about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the Orthodox Church, and you're continuing your, research into that. Can I ask you, Katie, to look back at this year, tumultuous year for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and give us your analysis of how we've ended up in 2022 and the changes that have occurred in Ukraine with the Orthodox Church, which represents so many Christians there.
At the beginning of the year, before the war, or the sort of special operations, right? There's been violence in eastern Ukraine since 2014. You had sort of two competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine. You had one under the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in Istanbul, and then you had the Moscow-based church. And the church under the church that had been formed, the Autocephalous Church, the independent church that had been formed by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, was relatively new. Though you could have discussions about that, right? The idea of forming it was that there was this ancient medieval church that was being restored. As the war has progressed, it has become increasingly clear that the Moscow-linked church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as opposed to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Moscow-linked church, had, first serious, sort of public relations problems. If you're at war with a country, the religious institution linked to that country is going to have trouble, but also that the Russian government was using not only the Russian church inside of Russia, but the Russian church abroad as an instrument of the Russian state, and how that looked in various circumstances was different. But in Ukraine, there was a real fear, and I think a justified fear, in a recent government raid in a monastery, the Monastery of the Caves, a very, very famous ancient monastery, gave credence to this, that the Russian church the Russian state was using Russian clerics and Russian church facilities as a base to carry out espionage and other military activities. In response to that, just recently, the Ukrainian government has put laws in place that, while not banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, open individual parishes and clerics up to greater scrutiny than they had previously been under. And I think this has created a very complicated situation, because the way these laws are written and the way they can be implemented are dangerous for those who care about things like religious liberty. However, there's a real national security threat associated with these Russia-linked clerics, and so I think that's the emerging story. What the war in Ukraine has done, and what the situation in Ukraine now with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church versus the Orthodox Church of Ukraine demonstrates, is a much longer ongoing conflict within the Orthodox world, as I always say, not dissimilar than what we saw in Islam in the first part of this century, between sort of modernizers, Western-looking people who want to create a modern, Western-looking orthodoxy, and what you might call traditionalists or hardliners or reactionaries who see the West, who see modernity as their enemy.
Are you in touch, Katie, with people on the ground in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church in Ukraine? Can you describe to us what life is like for the people that you regularly contact and speak to about these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, just on the very basic level, life in Ukraine right now is difficult, right? Just trying to organize phone calls around power outages and raids is difficult. And that sort of transcends, I think, sort of ideological and religious conflict related to it. However, and my contacts are largely with people in the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Constantinople-backed church. I think there's increasing frustration with the Russian-backed church, with Ukrainian Orthodox Church clerics. They have formally broken from Moscow, but their refusal really to denounce Patriarch Kirill, to denounce Putin. And there's, among the faithful, we've not seen, I mean, what's really interesting, I think, is among the faithful, you've not seen similar shifts, right? You haven't seen this grand shift, for example, towards the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And I think that that's because on the ground level, and many people I've spoken to have remained both in Ukraine and outside, who have remained in Moscow Patriarchate connected churches. On the ground level, that choice is about so many other things than Putin, than Patriarch Kirill, than the war. It's about, it's about heritage. It's about larger liturgical identities and theological identities. And so it's created conflict for people who have real attachments to the Russian-based church, to the Moscow-based church, to the Russian tradition church, who are now faced with really a church that has been completely co-opted by Vladimir Putin and his regime. And
thank you for everything you've written for us this year, Katie, and I hope we continue next year as well.
Yes, I'm happy to help in any way I can. I think part of what's interested me about this story is the deep misunderstandings in the West about Eastern Christianity. And having grown up in the Eastern Church in the West, I'm always very happy to explain these things. So
thank you. So we're turning now to Rosie Dawson, one of our journalists here at the Religion Media Centre. Rosie, I don't know, I'm quite struck by every single big story that's happened this year has had religion running through it like a ribbon. But there are certain stories that have been entirely about internal religious affairs. One of those in the summer was the Lambeth Conference of Global Anglican Bishops in Canterbury, where a lot of us went down to cover it, actually, and you did. I wonder if I could ask you to pick this story up. What was the most brilliant, most significant thing about the Lambeth Conference for you? What was the most outstanding thing when you saw all these bishops from every different country of the world gathering in Canterbury?
Well, I think when I was there, what struck me was the atmosphere was completely at odds with the sort of dominant narrative that was being played out off-stage, off-site, as it were, which was that these were bishops all at each other's throats over the issue of human sexuality. In one way, peace broke out, and in another way it didn't. I mean, certainly agreement on this issue did not break out. But I suppose the thing a few months on, to note is that there is still an Anglican communion and people are still talking to each other, because after the 2008 conference, I'm told that just before the conference, the Anglican communion officers really weren't putting anything in place for the future because they really didn't know if there would be such a thing as the Anglican communion anymore. And that hasn't happened and didn't happen this time. So I think that's perhaps the most noteworthy thing about it. I mean, the presenting issue, as it has been for the last few decades, was the issue of human sexuality. There was a resolution back in 1998 which said that same-sex marriage and unions were not the mind of the Anglican Communion. There were people who wanted that to be reaffirmed. There were people who didn't. The derailing nearly happened because there was a draft call to the conference which basically said this is the mind of the communion, and all hell broke loose, and there had to be a sort of restatement of the call, or a revision of the call, which just said, look, we are divided on this issue. That was a big area of discussion at the conference, but it wasn't all of it at all.
Did you think that Justin Welby played a blinder? He got some very good press after that for keeping everything on track.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably did play a blinder, really. He gave a speech where he said, look, in good faith, people believe that the traditional position, the majority of people in the Anglican Communion believe and hold to the traditional position in good faith. A minority think that that traditional position should be changed, and we aren't going to agree. I mean, he also sort of issued a plea. I mean, there was a real sense there that, a lot of the narrative was being, I don't want to say manipulated, but a lot of the narrative was being driven by people who weren't at the conference. And one of his pleas in his speech was to the bishops, is just turn off your phones. Don't listen for a moment to what people are saying out. Listen to what's going on within the hall. Listen to what's going on among your brother and sister bishops. And I think in that sense, he did. I mean, he said afterwards that it had exceeded all his hopes and expectations. And I think that he and his organisers will have come away extremely pleased with what emerged from the conference. I mean, what will be interesting is to see how this plays out going forward. I mean, there are continuing conversations going on in the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Consultative Committee is going to be meeting in February in Ghana, and actually it's going to be meeting just after the Church of England has discussed its process discussing same-sex unions in the Living in Love and Faith project. Now that, that's an internal church discussion in the Church of England, but we can't pretend that the wider Anglican Communion, who still see the Church of England as some way the mother church, are not going to be watching this extremely closely. And if church teaching and practice on this is changed, you can expect a blow up within the communion. I mean, I suppose just one other thing to say is that one of the reasons why there weren't massive blows up within the conference itself, apart from the fact that there was an awful lot of preparation to make sure that people had met and got to know people beforehand, was that it was boycotted by 3 provinces, which represent about at least a third of the Anglican Communion. So the naysayers, or the people who were really unhappy with what was happening, weren't there.
Christianity declining in England and Wales, the census says, under a half, but advancing in the global south, in Africa and South America, is the picture that emerged from that.
Yes, yeah. And I suppose the question is how might the Anglican Communion, or whether it will sort of reshape itself so that it what's the place of the Church of England within it, and does that remain the same? When the vast majority of Christians are in the global south, is there any sort of move for an Archbishop of Canterbury to come from somewhere outside of England, for instance? And I don't detect that, and I think some people would see that as a real missed opportunity to actually sort of think about, whether the leadership of the Anglican Communion needs to come from outside England. And one of the things that happened just before the conference was that there was a move to involve people from the Anglican Communion in the choice of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's leader of the Church of England, but also head of the Anglican Communion. And one might say, well, that's all very well for the Anglican Communion. They need that increased voice. But for the Church of England, it's seen as possibly allowing the Anglican Communion to interfere too much in its affairs, but also a sort of strengthening of the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Church of England, as the spiritual head of the Anglican Communion.
Interesting. Thank you, Rosie. Catherine, if you're still there, can I bring you back in again? It was also a big year for the Catholic Church, the Synod, the democratization, as it's been described, of the Catholic Church all over the world. I wonder how you would assess that process, whether you feel that it's going in a direction that's in the end going to win hearts, or whether you see the traditional backlash against it as being something that will impede its progress.
There has been a certain amount of backlash, but I think just the fact that people were asked for their views and sat down and talked in their different parishes was an important thing. I went to gatherings as part of this synodal process, meetings that then fed into what was said at the local deanery, and then that was taken further on into the diocese, and then that fed into to what was going on, what was taken to Rome from all over the world, and just feeling part of that mattered. And sometimes even just at the very local level, you had to talk to people who didn't share your views. I remember going to one meeting where a lot of women talked about the fact that we don't have women priests, a continuing neuralgic issue in the Catholic Church, and there were quite a few younger women at that meeting who weren't bothered about that at all. So we had to find a way of communicating and discussing this in a civil way. So I think the process mattered, just that we all had to talk. From what we've heard, some of the views of people that the senior officials in the church might find more unpalatable have been expressed. As to whether it will lead to change, in some ways I think that depends on whether Pope Francis stays in post for much longer, because he's quite determined to bring about some kind of reform, but it's whether he's there to see it through or not that's an issue, I think. He's clearly suffering from some physical ill health, and he's indicated, it emerged the other day, that he's already written his resignation letter in case he thinks the time has come when he can't do the job anymore, and that's sort of sealed away and it's in an envelope. But I think it's whether he's there that's key. Although having said that, although he's seen as the reforming pope, he's not very keen on women priests either. So there's only so far this elderly man from Buenos Aires will go.
Julia Bicknell, if you're on the call, another big story this year was the Freedom of Religion or Belief conference that was held at the Kiwi 2 Centre in July. And this was an international conference hosted by the government. I know you were there. How significant an event do you think that was?
I think it was significant in that the government actually put itself kind of out there. It followed a kind of an online conference that didn't really achieve very much at the height of COVID, which was hosted by Poland. And I think it was very important that the UK was seen to be leading on this as well and taking it as significant, because the danger has been that the whole sphere of global religious freedom had been quite strongly endorsed by the then Trump government. And so it was important that this was sort of taken out of that sphere and seen as a much more kind of international issue. So I think for those reasons alone, it was important. Yeah.
And what were the kind of takeaways that you got from the various conversations that you had with people around the world? The concerns about the freedom of religion. I know there are certain countries that have made the top of the World Watch list, countries like Nigeria, Afghanistan and so forth. Are there any signs of hope that this issue is being taken seriously by governments in the way that they deal with other countries in their foreign affairs relationships?
I think that obviously with many of these conferences it's as much about all the conversations that are going on outside the main room, the main presentations. I think it was a government event. There was an awful lot of, well, so and so has to be seen to be addressing the conference, going through sort of heads of religious denominations and others. But I think for me, what was most valuable was just actually having people across religious, both religions and religious denominations, getting together and actually having informal conversations about key issues like Pakistan, what is happening there. And you mentioned about how seriously is this being taken. I just noticed last week that a man, he's actually what they call a peer in Pakistan. He's now actually been sanctioned by the UK government. His name has come up over many years as someone who's been sort of, how should I say, tacitly supporting and encouraging the forced marriage of religious minority girls, particularly Hindu and Christian, to Muslims in Pakistan. And so, step by step, those kind of small incremental developments, you see that out of a big global ministerial conference, NGOs, civil society, as well as government can actually get together, recognise there are some things that can be done, and then take action against them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in the discussion. It was an incredible year, and I'm a bit depressed having listened to the way things have, the headlines that we've picked out to discuss. But I hope, as I say, that in the first week of January, we're looking ahead to 2023 with perhaps a bit more optimism of what there is to come next year. So I think it's time to shake ourselves off from 2022, have a great holiday over the Christmas season, and come back refreshed for the new year. Thank you for all your support this year, and thank you to Sorcha for all your work with us, Sorcha. We'll miss you very much, all your live tweeting efforts at these events, and wish you well for the future. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a happy holiday.